Welcome back to the McCain Institute's Summit for Democracy series and discussions. We're pleased that you joined us again today, where our focus turns to America's strategic alliances. And in fact, America's probably most strategic alliance, the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was founded more than 70 years ago. As you know, we're the McCain Institute. John McCain was an ardent supporter of NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance. In fact, he was probably the single most important political figure in modern times on both sides of the Atlantic that strove to deepen the relationship, particularly to defend against Russian aggression, increased populism, and authoritarianism in Europe and around the world. He would see the alliance needed more today than ever, as we see more and more belligerent Russia threatening the stability of Europe, the NATO alliance, and global order. Today, we'll be talking about the future of NATO, how to improve its public image, and the impact of mis, dis, and malinformation has had on the alliance. We have a great panel lined up for today, and I really want to welcome them and thank them for joining us today in this important discussion. First, we have Laura Thornton. Laura is the current director and senior fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Thank you, Laura. And next, we have Jamie Fly, also an alumnus of the German Marshall Fund and the founder of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the fund. But he's currently the president and CEO of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And finally, we have Harry Nedelku, who is the head of policy at Rasmussen Global. Thanks to each of you, and also thank you to the U.S. NATO mission for making this project possible for the McCain Institute. As I said in the kickoff, we're doing this discussion around the Summit of Democracy, which was held last week. President Biden and Secretary Blinken held this summit last week, but there's going to be a year of action around the summit. And I just wanted to kick off the discussion, when you think about the future of NATO, NATO member countries, how does democracy and adherence to democratic norms fit into that future? Let me ask Laura to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks so much for having me. This question, of course, is really, a no-brainer for me. I've spent the last 25 years as a democracy practitioner, so I think it fits into everyone's future, and NATO's no exception there. And of course, as we know, democracy is a key part of NATO's foundation. From the preamble to Article 2, it's pretty clear. And I think what also we have to keep in mind, and the summit, a lot of the discussion around the Summit for Democracy made this clear as well, is that we're seeing a period of global democratic backsliding. And that is true also in several NATO countries. I recently left the International IDEA, which is a Stockholm-based organization that tracks democracy around the world. And I was involved in developing their latest Global State of Democracy report. And for certain NATO countries, the picture is a little bit alarming. Slovenia has experienced severe democratic backsliding under the SDS, the Slovenian Democratic Party, which has critical media organizations and independent oversights. Bodies are coming under pressure. People have referred to it as the Urbanization of Slovenia. Hungary, of course, we know has experienced severe declines over the last decade. Freedom House has now called Hungary a partly free country, and it's seen across the board from civil liberties, clean elections, free political parties, judicial independence, and media integrity. Poland as well. And then there are, members of NATO that are not even considered full democracies. Montenegro, North Macedonia, partly free. Turkey is considered not free, with deepening autocratization. The summit sort of grappled with this in a peculiar way, and the criteria were not always quite clear for who was included and who wasn't. So we saw, of course, that Hungary and Turkey, NATO countries, were not invited. And what does that mean for NATO when countries do not even qualify to attend a summit for democracy? Of course, democracy is not only a values proposition, but a security one. And if countries continue to be threatened by international and domestic autocrats, we become less stable and the alliance is more fragile. Slipping democracies turn to other alliances and other partnerships. And there are also efforts from autocracies to shape global governance institutions, promoting alternative models. I think NATO is acutely aware of this and thus needs to think about how plans not only to deal with these slipping member states, and whether certain nations can still play a constructive role, given their strategic location, for example. We can see how members can stymie broader efforts. We just saw how Hungary, for example, upset EU's commitments at the summit. So NATO also has to think about that, but then also think about how it plans to bolster against further backsliding. So yes, I think it has to be on the agenda going forward.
Jamie, let me turn to you. As Laura said, there are many NATO countries that have slipped in freedom. Some are ranked as not free by Freedom House. How does democracy play into the future of NATO, and how does NATO defend against democracy when some of its own members aren't playing by the rules?
Well, thanks for having me, Paul. I completely agree with Laura's assessment. I think that democracy needs to be part of this conversation that NATO members are having with each other about this environment in which we're living, where we have rising authoritarianism, where we have actors like Russia, China, and others outside of NATO threatening the security of NATO members, trying to infiltrate our democracies and undermine democracy. It's not an easy conversation for the alliance, which is a security-focused alliance, which in the past I think has been rather reluctant to engage in conversations about, to really look inward and engage in conversations about what's going on with domestic politics in member states. But I think it is a conversation that needs to happen. And I think it can't just be NATO, though, talking amongst its own members. There are other institutions like the European Union that need to be part of this conversation because those political fora have the opportunity to maybe engage in some of the conversation about domestic politics that NATO leaders may not even be well positioned to talk about, especially if their focus is on security. I think from a US perspective, it's important that NATO allies understand that part of being open about these issues is also ensuring that the Article 5 guarantee can be followed through in the future. We've seen even in the recent weeks with the crisis over Ukraine, which is obviously not a NATO member, a lot of conversation in the American media picking up on Russian, for instance, disinformation about Ukrainian politics, trying to undermine Ukraine's viability as an independent state, to throw accusations that Ukraine is somehow a corrupt democracy, not a fully functional democracy. And it's all with the goal of convincing Americans that Ukraine is not worth supporting. And I think for some of the NATO allies, that's a real concern too in the future. We could see directed campaigns against NATO allies where the goal is convincing the citizens of other NATO countries that this ally is not worthy of your support. And so it's important that when we look one ally to another, that we have a shared understanding of whether you're adhering to the values that underpin NATO and that you're living up to your commitments that were established when the alliance was formed. And so I think for the security and safety of all of the allies, having an open conversation about these issues before they get to the point where we may now be at with some NATO allies like Hungary, for instance, is incredibly important because you head off those future concerns that we might have under scenarios where other allies are asked to step in and pay the ultimate price in support of the alliance.
And Harry, as Jamie said, NATO is a security alliance. It's not necessarily an alliance of democracies. But as Jamie was alluding to, we have issues in Ukraine, and that raises questions about what happens if there's further incursions by Russian troops into Ukraine. So how does this issue of democracy in member states play into its future?
I think democracy fits with NATO like a glove. I mean, as Laura correctly pointed out, two countries and NATO allies were not invited, Hungary and Turkey. And while there was a lot of sort of discussion around the decisions that informed why some countries were invited or not, these two were the most contentious. And of course, they should be read as not Hungary and Turkey, but rather Orban and Erdogan were not invited, which means the implication here is that if, let's say, these countries were to rebuild their democracies, then they could be invited back at the next summit because a follow-up summit has been announced. And the message here is that I think the underlying message is the U.S. is very interested in these countries building back their democracies, and that it is holding NATO allies to higher standards. When you cooperate to such a degree politically and militarily, when you have such a high degree of interoperability between your military and the U.S. military and other allies, you cannot afford to be half a democracy. You cannot be on the edge. You need to be fully committed to the values of the North Atlantic Treaty. So that's one aspect. The second one is, let's not forget sort of the background against which this summit has taken place, which is to be a rallying point for democracies around some basic principles, but to counter the rise of autocracies like China and Russia. We saw how China and Russia went into overdrive trying to attack the summit, including trying to undermine it by forcing some invitees, China forcing Pakistan, telling Pakistan not to attend. But the other background is Putin building up his troops on the border with Ukraine, which has created the real concern across the Atlantic that he might seek to invade. So really against this backdrop, when we think about NATO's role in future is really to enforce its role as the only platform to prevent war in Europe and to deter Russia, but also to have a greater say in the Indo-Pacific. So we already kind of see hints of that, looking at the new strategic concept, which will come out at the next summit in Madrid in 2022. We already see NATO defense ministers approving a new master plan, basically to defend against a simultaneous attack from Russia in the Baltic and the Black Sea, including hybrid attacks and nuclear weapons, which is pretty much the most comprehensive plan that NATO has had and beefing up its territorial defense, which it already started doing in 2014. But then we also see, finally on China, NATO seeking a greater role, already calling it a challenger in the latest summit. And increasingly, we were seeing conversations at NATO, not only when it comes to on issues when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, but also on China. And we see the US actually pushing allies to call out Beijing a lot more and to take China more seriously within the framework of NATO.
Thanks, Harry. I want to pivot a little bit back to something that Jamie brought up in his opening remarks about the issue around mis and disinformation. You obviously had a massive media organization with massive viewership and listenership throughout NATO member countries and beyond. And you've seen the firsthand impact of mis, dis, and malinformation throughout Radio Free Europe countries, but also NATO countries. How is this issue around misinformation, disinformation, malinformation really impacting sort of the cohesion of NATO? I mean, we've seen, the United States get attacked by misinformation. I mean, all of us are in sort of our daily lives in many ways. But how is it impacting sort of this cohesion that we're seeing, that each of you brought up as you're seeing, as member states kind of drifting away from this cohesive alliance?
It's a structural problem, not just within NATO countries, but it's a modern problem that we face across many countries at the media landscape. We've obviously seen a rise in people using digital means to get their news and information, which in general is a positive thing. But it's made it very difficult for the traditional media model of independent media to survive. We've seen that in the local setting in the United States. We see it across Europe. We see it in the post-Soviet space where RFERL operates. And we've seen many actors, both kind of local actors sometimes with a political agenda, step in, oligarchs and others who want to take advantage of that. And we see hostile actors like Russia and China exploiting that modern media landscape to advance their narratives, whether in the Chinese case, it's about the origins of COVID or about what their ambition is for global leadership, or in the Russian case in particular, of often a very anti-alliance message, an effort to pit members against each other, to undermine confidence, in their willingness to support each other in moments of crisis. And you see this again and again, depending on what the current topics are. So it's a common challenge given the media landscape. And that's why we believe that independent media, including through some of the work that RFERL does, is so important, because you can expose those disinformation campaigns. You can remind people of the facts. You can provide a platform for unbiased news and information. And we've started to do that again in recent years, being asked to go back into several markets that we had left after the end of communism, and returning to Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. So returning to 3 NATO members, partly for this very reason, the fact that the media landscape was becoming skewed in those countries, but also the landscape was open to foreign interference and infiltration in a very dangerous way, trying to convince citizens of those newer NATO members that the alliance was not worth the effort. The alliance and their fellow allies were not delivering for them. And so by providing factual reporting, we can help respond to that challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more important, I think, for any democracy well, there are a lot of things, but having unbiased media where people get their information is extremely important in the United States and throughout NATO and throughout the world. And as we've seen here in the United States, and Laura, I want to pivot over to you, especially with your experience focusing on elections around the world. Obviously you focus on elections still through your work at the Alliance, but also your previous work at IDEA and also through NDI. I know, again, NATO is not an alliance of democracies necessarily, but when countries are manipulated, elections are manipulated, that has an impact. And should or how can NATO talk about election manipulation as a threat to the alliance itself?
No, that's a really good question. And, we certainly at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, we do look at election integrity, but we're also tracking these efforts of Russia and China, and actually also Iran, and how they're undermining democracies in multitude of ways, and how foreign malign efforts also bleed into domestic ones. Your question is about elections, but just really quickly, I wanted to lay out how both Russia and China have actually engaged in information operations around NATO specifically, and Jamie was sort of referring to this as well. But just, I just pulled up some stuff from our dashboard, and in 2021 alone, Russian accounts have tweeted about NATO 5,877 times, and the narratives are, plentiful. About Russia's MFA putting out a statement outlining this 5 so-called myths about NATO-Russia relations, NATO spreading COVID-19, a NATO state created COVID-19. So Russian state media is talking about how Latvian lab developed it, while Chinese state media is talking about how it was developed in Maryland. NATO seeking Russian test subjects, Montenegro's NATO accession. And while China's a little bit less active on NATO as a big topic of their information campaigns, in 1999, the bombing of the Chinese embassy obviously got a lot of play, but they're now starting to dig in. And from Afghanistan to Ukraine, Chinese diplomats and state media are portraying NATO as an aggressor. With regard to election interference, obviously this is a tactic malign actors use to destabilize democracies, not necessarily with NATO sort of front and center of mind, but Russia's keen to sow distrust and messiness more broadly. And election interference can be sort of a multitude of things, as we've discussed, thwarting sort of informed choice through disinformation, burrowing into wedge issues, undermining faith in the process, which is something I'm particularly concerned about, whether it's, selling the big lie or spreading disinformation around mail-in voting, which they tried to do in Germany as well, creating this unlevel playing field by putting their thumb on the scale on behalf of a candidate, or even funding political parties, as I saw in the Caucasus, far-right Russian parties, or collusion, Operation Research, and attacking infrastructure, of course, is always a possibility. So the more divided and preoccupied NATO countries are internally, the less focused theoretically they are on global security and international governance. And so in the case of wanting a specific outcome, we know Russia was interfering on behalf of Trump in 2020. And that's another sort of more extreme case. So NATO should take election interference as a threat to the alliance. And they actually have, I think, outlined a strategy. And they're looking at sort of common standards for strategic communications. And I think another thing they've talked a lot about with elections is debunking disinformation. And this is a great start, but it's not really sufficient to tackle like deeper problems of electoral trust. So like the big lie, for example, is not going to be shaken by debunking disinfo. In fact, people usually adhere more to their beliefs after it's been fact checked. And, again, it's also not going to be thwarted by strategic communications programs. So, we can talk about this maybe later in the conversation, but I think sort of addressing election trust is going to take more of a demand side approach to build faith in the electoral process, which is going to involve working with citizens and youth, particularly at a young age.
Well, you actually led to my next question for Harry about this issue around citizenry and a younger population. Right, NATO spans almost three oceans basically, and when you talk about Canada, the United States on the Pacific and the Atlantic, and hundreds of millions of people, and you have original signatories like the United States, Portugal, Spain, the UK, and many other countries, and then you have newer member countries, the Baltics and the former Eastern Bloc, and then you see where NATO resonates in the Eastern Bloc, especially around the Baltics, but in those original member countries, NATO maybe doesn't even resonate, doesn't even come on the radar for many young people. So, I think, Harry, I'd love to get your perspective on how NATO, I want to say, can rebrand itself, but how can it reinvigorate itself to a younger generation?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, like you correctly point out, the younger generation is not a monolith. A millennial in the Eastern flank would have a very different idea about how to deter Russia than a millennial in Southern Europe, let's say. And even inside certain regions, there are differences. For example, polls show that young Czechs are more pro-NATO, less EU, but Slovaks across the border are less pro-NATO, but more pro-EU. But actually, even in some countries in the South, Spain, France, and Germany, for example, you have actually more young people trusting that, for instance, the United States would come to their aid in the case of a Russian attack and uphold Article 5 than older generations. So they're not a monolith, but you're right that there are certain things that of course can be done. Specifically two, one, involving the younger generation, let's say, in the greater strategic agenda setting of the alliance. But this is something that actually NATO has already started doing. So in 2019, allies asked the Secretary General to come up with a forward-looking reflection process about NATO in the next 10 years. And the Secretary General appointed a group of 10 experts, but alongside of them, 14 emerging leaders, young leaders from across the alliance to inform his recommendations for NATO 2030. And this has actually translated into leaders sort of endorsing this agenda at the latest summit. So that's one thing. Second is to tackle some of the issues that younger generations care about. For instance, climate change. And already we see signs of this in the 2030 agenda. But specifically here, again, NATO could do two things. One, it's to integrate climate into and considerations about climate into its operations and strategy, including at a political level. So really embedding climate change, for instance, into the upcoming strategic concept. Second is to improve energy efficiency and set green targets, including when it comes to defense planning. I mean, here, a good example of this could be ESG standards. We apply ESG standards, for instance, when we factor environmental measures alongside financial performance. Companies do that. And lately we see a lot of progress on this, both in the US and in the EU. Actually, here in the European Union, the taxonomy, the EU taxonomy will be presented this week on this. So a similar, for instance, mechanism, setting ESG standards, if you will, for NATO allies when it comes to defense planning could be an avenue of this. And one way in which it could work is to embed them in the 2% matrix. So getting the defense industry alongside armed forces to actually come up with plans to reduce emissions by 2030. So these could be two sort of avenues in which, like you say, NATO could appeal more to the concerns of the younger generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you certainly, as you said, you pointed out, the youth, it's not a monolith. You know, every young population and person has their own opinions, and it differs country by country. But I think you bring up, issues that really are important to a younger generation, the issue around environmentalism, green economy, et cetera. So I really appreciate you, bringing those to the fore. I want to pivot a little bit back to the actual threats to NATO, as we are seeing today with Russian aggression, especially on the Ukrainian border, as we've seen in Georgia and in other, I would say frontline states that maybe not be NATO member states, but with aggression towards Ukraine and Georgia, Ukraine bordering on NATO member countries. What I think this is the big question. How does NATO get involved, or does NATO get involved if there is if there's an attack on Ukraine or Georgia? So I'd love to hear your opinion, Laura. I mean, you spent a lot of time in Georgia, and I know maybe Ukraine not so much, but your experience there, living and understanding sort of that situation, and where NATO is still very popular.
No, it's true. NATO is very popular there, but it's fragile. So, that I'd like to, rather than weigh in on sort of Biden-Putin discussions or external strategies to deal with the buildup, but rather focus on what NATO can do from sort of the inside. And what I think is important in NATO in Georgia, as well as Ukraine, where I have actually also worked, is that issue that Harry was talking about a little bit, about maintaining public support. And countering declining democratic governance, which is pushing leaders perhaps towards more non-alignment. And in Georgia, I led public opinion research for 6 years that focused on the country's security and European and Euro-Atlantic integration aspirations, working with NATO Liaison Office and NATO Information Center, as well as the Ministry of Defense. And what I find interesting is, while support is high, Kremlin narratives are sticking. Culture and values narratives, linking NATO to anti-church, gender issues, LGBTQ issues even became sort of wrapped up in NATO disinformation. Blackmail and Russian aggression. So this perception among the public that security means being aligned with Russia. The influx of refugees was also a very common thing, and tapping into xenophobia in the case of Georgia, with Turkey being a NATO member. Russian military might. It's interesting that more Georgians believe that the Russian military is bigger and stronger than the United States. So that's been a very effective message from Russia in Georgia. And in both countries, Soviet nostalgia. In Georgia, I couldn't believe that, people believed that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was a bad thing, like 46%. So yes, while there is this high level of support, 72% of Georgians believe NATO membership means conflict. 42% believes NATO dictates that they adopt Western cultural values. 20% believe that it threatens the church. So, internally, and Ukraine, I think, also has a high support. It does have high support for NATO, just over 40%, but also believed in this sort of perceived blackmail situation, that NATO's not bad per se, but Russia will never allow it. And there were different age variations in this support for NATO and fragility around it. But anyway, in terms of actions that NATO can pursue sort of domestically, the STRATCOM efforts, strategic communications efforts, have been good, but there is a need for a lot better research in terms of how to improve targeting, what mediums to use to reach people, and the messaging required. Like, NATO Stratcom Center in Riga is doing some of this research. But we were figuring out, for example, who is vulnerable. Is it rural, older, minority settlements? How to reach them? Where do they get their information? Is it internet? Social media is not always the best place to reach vulnerable populations who might not have access to the internet. Language considerations. There was this absolute refusal to work in Azeri and Armenian language, which was actually some of the more vulnerable populations in terms of anti-NATO sentiment. Testing messages. I mean, one thing that I always found remarkable in terms of NATO's Stratcom was that they were tackling these emotive, funny, engaging Kremlin disinformation narratives with like 10-point fact sheets, which just was not appealing or working. And also the messengers, like sending, some young kids from Kiev or Tbilisi out to talk to like rural communities about why NATO is really important is just not going to be as effective as having, your local priest come on board. And my Ukrainian friends get quite cross with me because I also did research about the value of restricting Russian television. And at least our research in Georgia proved that watching Russian television actually didn't have an impact on perceptions of NATO and the European Union for that matter. But also and I'll end here, but on democracy decline, I think NATO has made an effort and should continue supporting that broader democracy programming, including like legislative support, working with the trust groups in parliament, improving oversight, tabletop exercises, and supporting more robust civil society and journalists on civic education and disinfo programming. So I think there is, in addition to sort of an external view towards, the buildup in Ukraine or just the general threat that Russia poses to aspiring NATO members, we need to think about how to bolster support internally within those countries.
Harry, you're between Denmark, Copenhagen, and Brussels. You've had experience working in Canada, but also at NATO headquarters in Brussels. And you often, I hear this all the time, we all do, about leaders talk about the rules-based order, the global rules-based order established after World War II. And many leaders in Western countries still talking about this. And NATO emerged out of this. But NATO's adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, and others, have kind of thrown out these rules. And they're kind of coming up with a new set of rules or just, not even rules. They're just doing what they want for their own national interests. So how can the West and NATO respond to sort of, is there an end to the rules-based order? So it's not a game of whack-a-mole. How does NATO and Western allies address the issue of sort of this end of the rules?
Yeah, it's definitely a game of whack-a-mole because the post-World War II rules-based international order is being challenged on multiple fronts at the same time. If we look at Russia's aggression in eastern Ukraine and its illegal annexation of Crimea, then we have 2 years later, we have China increasing its aggressive posturing in the South China Sea, building up artificial islands, increasing incursions in Taiwan in its airspace. And then at the same time as the West is, and particularly the United States, is pivoting to the Indo-Pacific, then we see the Russian buildup of its military in eastern Ukraine. So these things are happening one after the other. And against this backdrop, we also have democracy backtracking elsewhere, Afghanistan, military coups in Sudan, in Myanmar, civil war in Ethiopia, with the potential to lead to a disintegration of that country alongside ethnic and regional lines. So yes, definitely, there is a game of whack-a-mole here. I think NATO and the West can do three things. One is to show unity, and to some regard, this is what the recent Summit of Democracy just did. It's meant to show that unity. We saw, for instance, in the aftermath of Russia building up its military in Ukraine, the United States and its allies including at the G7, making clear statements about the economic consequences that Russia would face if it were to ever invade. So that's one. Two, show strength and credibility that actually NATO will fulfill Article 5. And that is, it goes hand in hand with continuing to commit to the 2% commitment to beef up its GDP. And that investment pledge was made in 2014. And NATO allies are increasingly reaching that target or on their way to reach that target. And then the third point is, we need to show sort of that we have a plan, that we have a vision. So for instance, on NATO, what I mean by that is, of course, without trying to provoke Russia, but making clear that Russia's aggression, including by fomenting these separatist republics that are meant to sort of hijack the democratizing effect in these countries and the integration of these countries with the West, that it will not work. Because otherwise Russia would have really gotten its way at a very low cost. So one way to do that is, of course, priority is to, as we speak right now, the Russians still have about 100,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, so it is to deal with that. But long term, to have some type of a plan to still ensure that there is still an open door policy. One example of this, and again, coming back to Georgia, because Georgia is also a smaller country and also probably a little bit more prepared to join NATO, is to say that if and when it will be ready, a country like Georgia could join NATO, where Article 5 would apply based on the West German model on the territory that Georgia controls. When it comes to sort of the broader West, we have to think, there's one thing to talk about military aggression, and that's more about Russia, but there's also economic aggression, and we see that a lot when it comes to China. Again, having a vision and a plan on how to deal with that in a meaningful way. We saw Chinese aggression when it comes to Australian wine, to Lithuanian companies, to Swedish retailers. So what to do about that? Again, based on the NATO model of an Article 5, perhaps having an economic Article 5, where we could have a menu of sanctions, and we could leverage the fact that actually the democratic world represents 60% of the world GDP. And that's a language that Beijing understands. So it's the issue of leveraging that and making sure that we can have the tools in place if a country like China decides to economically bully, let's say, a democracy.
Yeah. And Harry, I want to come back in a little bit about this issue around Article 5 in China. We haven't talked a lot about China. We've kind of touched upon it, but not so much. But Jamie, I want to talk about the changing environment, the rules-based order. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, again, came out of the ashes of World War II to establish news and information for Europe. Often from an American perspective, but from sort of independent. Obviously, Radio Free Europe has emerged and changed over the years. And as you said, you're back in Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. But with these changing environments, how is Radio Free Europe changing? Especially when your main sometimes your media is being blocked, and media in general is having to refocus or redevelop its areas to kind of its changing environment, especially in closed societies where Radio Free Europe operates.
Yeah, it's a significant challenge, and especially in the last several years, we've seen a major authoritarian crackdown on independent media. We've seen media come under attack even in advanced democracies. It's now become the norm for US politicians or even European politicians to insult journalists, to raise questions about the agenda of journalists. And we've seen regimes like the Putin regime and the Lukashenko regime take that to an entirely another level, where journalism is essentially criminalized now in Belarus, for instance, where we have a very active Belarusian service. We've been designated a foreign agent by the Putin regime. We have our bank accounts frozen inside Russia. We've got almost every week more of our journalists being designated as individual foreign agents, essentially being called spies and being harassed by the Kremlin. And so when you have that sort of restrictive environment, the reason those authoritarians are doing that is for information control, to try to maintain their grip on power, and to try to prevent their citizens from being informed about the facts about what is actually going on in those countries. So one of our biggest challenges, and really our first challenge, is just to make sure that we can still be there. We can still be side by side with our audiences, producing relevant news and information that they otherwise could not obtain. And we do that through a variety of means. We obviously support our staff as much as possible in those closed environments. We use technology to circumvent efforts to block our websites or to block access on social media platforms. And we have a lot of success doing that. When we can get through the circumvention and still reach the audience, we see the results that it can have. I mean, I've been told, not just in terms of us reaching our audience, but propping open the information space for other actors, I've been told by some of our competitors that we play an important role in these closed and closing markets because we are able to report on sensitive topics that otherwise the small little local outlets could not touch. One of my first trips to Tajikistan 2 years ago as our FIRL president, one of the small outlets that is operating there and still surviving said, because you report A, B, and C, I can at least report A as a fact, because I can cite you and the fact that you reported it, and I won't get shut down by the government for just repeating your reporting. And so often it's not even just about driving up our own numbers, but about helping to pry open the information space a bit. We also spend a lot of time adapting to the audience. And Laura was getting at this a bit with talking about how NATO needs to engage different types of audiences. Well, we see this in the information space every day. You can't just broadcast with journalists from the capital city and expect to be relevant to the entire population. You need to be covering issues that people actually care about, similar to the conversation with young people. And we often find that, especially in these authoritarian regimes, people eventually start to tune out politics. They get sick of it. They realize that there's not a lot of potential for change. But what it does cause them to refocus on are the topics that affect their day-to-day lives. And so we make sure that a lot of our reporting touches on those topics as well. We still cover high politics, but we also cover topics that are relevant to people that they can use to make decisions about themselves and their families. And that draws our audience to us. And then we also adapt to whatever the media environment is, whatever the preferred platforms are, to make sure that we can reach them on their wavelength. And obviously, it's much more complicated than it was at our founding 70 years ago, where it was just through radio. But now we need to make sure we're on the relevant social media platform, that we're engaging them in their comfortable space. And when we do that, especially online, it opens up opportunities to also tackle the broader disinfo challenge, not just through fact checking, which I agree with Laura is incredibly difficult to do well and to have an impact, but doing innovative styles of journalism, using visual journalism, data journalism, ways in which you can help rebut some of these arguments that the authoritarians are pushing in those societies, but do so in an interactive way that draws the audience in. And so those are the types of ways that we continue to adapt and modernize our operations to make sure we're relevant in all of our markets.
Jimmy, is really, happy to hear, people, whether it's here in the United States or across NATO member countries for Radio Free or around the world, obviously there might be a high level of distrust of big media organizations, but when they know their local journalists, they know their community leaders, there is that trust that's built, and they start believing and trusting the news that's coming from one of their own. So I think it's really important what you all are doing at Radio Free Europe, getting those local voices, those local journalists out, and adapting to the environment that they're in, to build that trust of viewership, leadership, listenership. So it couldn't be. That's a great model that I think we are seeing more and more of again, as we are seeing that people are hopefully reverting back to a little bit more around local news. I do want to, bring up, as I said, the issue of China. We haven't talked about it quite a bit. Obviously, with NATO, obviously the biggest aggressor against NATO has always been Russia, but China obviously is much bigger than it ever was, and is playing a role around the world through its Belt and Road Initiative, that we are seeing, throughout Europe and around the world. The United States can easily take on China and forcefully, condemn human rights abuses, boycott, the Winter Olympics diplomatically, without damage because, of the nature of the Chinese and the United States relationship economically. We see, Lithuania taking a stand, as it relates to Taiwan as well. But is China weakening the NATO alliance? And how can, kind of getting back to this question of the comment about a whack-a-mole, where China is trying to, build these alliances, but these countries also have their national interest, and you can't get away from China economically. So I just wondered, from your perspectives, how does China play a role negatively in the NATO alliance, and how can NATO work with its members to counter sort of this aggressive China? Perry, do you want to start us off there?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. China is not moving troops next to our borders anytime soon, but it is borrowing a lot from Moscow's playbook, from disinformation to using economic coercion. I mean, on the economy side, I think just to give you some numbers, I mean, in 2008, just around the financial crisis, Chinese FDI in Europe was 2 billion, and then 8 years later it was 40 billion. So that is almost a growth of 2,000%. And then it has subsided in the meantime. But the problem with this is that this is not just Chinese companies, private companies coming in, trying to get the best value for their buck. It's companies that have ties to the Chinese state that are coming in, and they're acquiring strategic nodes of transportation, airports, harbors. The Greek port of Piraeus is a very good example of that. And it is leveraging those not only to sort of create a system to better export its goods, but rather to use an economic foothold in order to also establish a political foothold. What I mean by that is leveraging those investments and forcing some of the countries where it has acquired these, or made these acquisitions, to change their foreign policy. An example of that is, again, using Greece. The former government of Greece being coerced to water down the positions of the European Union when it came to China's human rights record. So there's a clear way in which we see that NATO, being a consensus alliance, would be weakened by these types of actions. Another example is going for the smaller countries in NATO, such as Montenegro. So there, a loan that is about $1 billion for a country that has a GDP of $5 billion clearly, has a huge leverage on Montenegro, which incidentally is also one of the front runners when it comes to the candidate countries that have the highest likelihood, let's say, to be the first to join in a future enlargement of Europe. So yes, we have all these, basically all this economic coercion, to which NATO itself, like I said before, maybe is not the first responder. But NATO, and we can draw inferences from NATO, and again, Article 5, specifically at NATO, in order to find ways in which we could deal with the type of bullying that we're seeing now, including, as I mentioned before, bullying of Lithuanian companies. As we know, Lithuania opened relations with Taiwan. As a result, China not only stopped imports from Lithuania, but bullied other multinational companies from ever actually using Lithuanian companies for their parts. and trying to scare them that they will no longer have access to the Chinese market. So dealing with situations like that and ensuring that Beijing cannot bully smaller, especially smaller allies, by having a system that can counteract through some sanctions or some other means. And again, leveraging the fact that actually democracies have a greater chunk of the world GDP than all the authoritarian governments put together.
Jamie or Laura, do you have a comment on the relationship between China and its impact on NATO?
I think I would just add, I mean, the interesting thing, not necessarily focused on NATO members, although we do see growing Chinese influence across NATO members, is as I look across the post-Soviet space and look at what our audiences, what topics they care about, and what topics they feel affect them, China is a growing concern for our audiences. And so we see this certainly across Central Asia, some of the NATO aspirants in the Balkans, even in places like Ukraine, where there's been some Chinese attempts at investment. China is becoming a daily topic that people feel affects their lives, and they want to see more reporting about it. So we've actually, over the last 2 years, been prioritizing our coverage of China and refocusing some of our attention, which in the past was focused on Russia, to looking at the role that Beijing plays across our region. And what we discover is that governments in our region often are trying to hide the true nature of their relationship with Beijing from their publics, because it's often a very controversial relationship. Even when it does bring economic dividends, there are often hidden costs. We hosted the Taiwanese foreign minister here at our headquarters in Prague a couple months ago, and he gave an interview to one of our journalists that we put out to all of our services, where the way he put it is, think twice. Think twice before you take these deals, before you go down that path, because there are often hidden costs. And we do see that the publics in many of the countries we serve are noticing that more and more, and trying to demand more from their governments, more information about what the true nature of the deal was, more information about the costs for the country, and often the kickbacks and the corruption that goes along with it. And so it's a topic that we're going to continue to focus on in the years ahead.
Thanks, Jimmy. And Laura, I'm going to bring you in a second, as we're closing in at the top of the hour here. I just want to kind of get your last thoughts on sort of what we're all here to talk about is this issue around disinformation. And I know, Laura, with the Alliance for Securing Democracy, this is something that you're focused on quite a bit. And NATO and its members are facing a growing threat from disinformation, misinformation, malinformation campaigns that can be tracked to NATO aggressors, adversaries, and proxies. So can NATO cohesively and effectively combat what is essentially a cyber war? Is this where, and as Harry's been mentioning and all of you have been mentioning, where you call in Article 5? Laura.
Right. Well, I think, like you said, I mean, we're all sort of combating this new war. And so inevitably, NATO should be part of that process. But I would say not acting alone, but joining these multitude of efforts to defend against malign information operations and leveraging member state capabilities. Estonia, for example, has unique and proactive methods to get ahead of disinfo narratives. Numerous organizations within the NATO alliance have expertise in emerging tech and elections and cybersecurity. So I think that NATO should work hand in glove with other organizations and states and not reinvent the wheel. I know that NATO PA has set up a working group, for example, on establishing a center to strengthen democratic resilience, looking at a bunch of different things from StratCom to elections, tech, media literacy. And I think the blueprint is quite heavy on addressing the supply and the channels. And as with other organizations in which we're promoting democracy, I think the demand side is going to be what's really critical. And NATO should start thinking about how to invest there. Regulating platforms will be a big part of this, taking on the business model that promotes disinfo and hate speech. investing in local media, but also focusing on that citizen resilience. How do we inoculate publics against sort of the siren calls of illiberal movements? I think that's going to be our key challenge going forward. Because at the bottom line is that we, the people, are kind of the problem. Like we're electing autocrats at the ballot box. So I think how we can build community resilience, and NATO can play a role here. I think they already are providing technical assistance, to legislatures and political parties will be important. Establishing and helping support what I would call the referees, nonpartisan and independent institutions that serve as sort of checks and that people trust to call the balls and the strikes. And in supporting and investing in communities and public participation and re-engagement in governance. I think a role that public diplomacy can play there as well. There have been efforts that NATO's taken to try to invest in a national narrative, the preemptive messaging about tolerance or innovation, about liberty, as opposed to just the whack-a-mole defense that we've been talking about. And another thing that research that we did for NATO in the Caucasus is showcasing shortcomings of alternative models and authoritarian regimes actually was effective in moving the needle and bolstering public trust in NATO and the alliance. So I think NATO definitely has to play this role. I think making it front and center, which they've already discussed, investing in that sort of community building, local independent media, civic education, but importantly, working hand in glove with other organizations and not trying to sort of go it alone or start over, I think will be very important.
And Jamie and Harry, what are your comments about NATO cohesively and effectively combating essentially what is no longer a conventional wars, but more of the cyber war issue?
Yeah, no, I think Lara is completely right. The best strategy is to have a critical citizenry. We cannot fight against disinformation and eliminate disinformation. It will always be there. The point is to make your citizens immune to it. What NATO can do, here's what NATO cannot do. It's not the outlet for it. NATO cannot tell people what the truth is. I think no organization can. But it can work with civil society, and it can work with organizations that do the fighting, if you will, identifying that disinformation and calling it out. We've been talking here about fact checking and that giving mixed results. And of course, because people live in bubbles, and sometimes there's two problems. One, the information isn't received because it doesn't reach the bubble, and two, even if it does, people won't believe it. So the best way to do it, and we've done a bit of work as well, not so much on NATO, but on Ukraine and Macedonia and other cases, is to sort of try to inform consumers, citizens, being critical about the origin of the information and the motives behind it. So basically questioning why, or rather not so much the message, but the messenger, and why the messenger is putting that information out there. So it's really working with those organizations, trying to work with them and trying to have them sort of call out this information when they see it.
Jamie, we're going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Laura and Harry. I think NATO can play a role with raising awareness about the threat, about sharing information about specific disinformation and cyber campaigns. I think a lot of progress has been made on this in recent years, but there probably still needs to be more work done. I was struck in my previous life at GMF to discover in the wake of the 2016 election how little information was actually being shared between allies about what happened in the US or the French elections or for German elections, partly because these were domestic issues that allies weren't really comfortable talking about, even with some of their closest security partners. But that's an area where I think now more has been done, and there are a lot of private initiatives like the Alliance for Security and Democracy and others sharing information in the public space, which is helpful. And so that's important. I think NATO can leverage its partnerships with countries like Georgia and Ukraine and others on the periphery to learn from them, which is something we also weren't doing, I think, before 2016, where we just kind of thought that this was an Eastern problem. This was never something that would affect advanced Western democracies. and we realized that we were sadly mistaken, and that a lot of the tools, especially which Russia was applying in countries like Ukraine, could easily work in our own democracies. And so I think learning from those countries on the periphery, but then also helping them build the institutions necessary to respond to this challenge is incredibly important. And then finally, outside of NATO's remit, I think we need more support for independent media. I think some strides were made last week at the Democracy Summit, but we need a lot more US coordination with its allies to bolster independent media, to invest in independent media, to make sure that there are truth tellers in the media ecosystems in both our own countries as well as abroad. And I think that a lot more coordination can happen on that front as well, and that remains a work in progress.
Jamie, that's a great last point. Support for independent and verified media is probably the best defense for NATO at the end of the day. As we are seeing, the cyber wars, the misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation really penetrate all of our societies. So I have to end it here, unfortunately. It's been an hour. I really want to thank each of you, Harry, Jamie, and Laura, for joining us today in this important conversation about the future of NATO, its public image, how it's combating this threat of mis and malinformation. This issue of NATO is very important to the McCain Institute and the legacy of Senator McCain. So thank you to each of you for everything that you're doing, defending democracy, whether it's, in Europe, Asia, or around the world. Each of you are playing your role in this effort to secure, our democracies around the world. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. And thank you to our audience and tuning in.